The flight attendant looked at the girl's ticket for barely a second before ripping it in half. "This is fake," she said coldly. "Step aside." The girl froze, staring at the torn pieces in shock. Her ticket was real. Her father had booked this flight. She belonged here. But before she could speak, the flight attendant waved over security. "Get her out of here." Passengers looked away. No one said a word. But just as the security guards reached for her, the plane's engines shut down, and over the intercom, a deep, commanding voice spoke. "This flight is not leaving until we fix something very important." Everything changed in that moment. And the flight attendant? She had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. Now let's get into it. The airport was buzzing with passengers eager to get to their destinations. The long lines, the sound of rolling suitcases, and the constant announcements over the intercom filled the air. Among the crowd stood Aaliyah, gripping her boarding pass tightly, her heart pounding with excitement. It was her first time flying alone, and she had been waiting for this day for weeks. She clutched her backpack, adjusting the strap over her shoulder, reminding herself that everything was in order. Her father had booked this ticket himself, making sure there would be no issues. As she stepped forward in line, she noticed how easily the passengers ahead of her were getting their tickets scanned. The flight attendant at the gate barely glanced at them before waving them through with a polite nod. Aaliyah exhaled, feeling a little nervous but ready. She smiled politely as she handed over her ticket to Karen Monroe, the flight attendant at the gate. Karen, a middle-aged woman with neatly tied hair and sharp eyes, took the ticket but didn't scan it immediately. Instead, she frowned, her lips tightening as she looked Aaliyah up and down. Her fingers tapped against the paper, her expression unreadable. A few seconds passed. Aaliyah waited. Passengers behind her shifted impatiently, and she could feel their eyes on her. Then, without warning, Karen let out a sharp breath, took the ticket with both hands and tore it straight down the middle. The sound of ripping paper was louder than anything else at that moment. Aaliyah's breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled slightly as she looked at the torn ticket pieces falling to the floor. Her stomach twisted in confusion. "This ticket is fake," Karen said, her voice cold and dismissive. "You're not getting on this plane." A stunned silence followed. Aaliyah blinked, trying to process what had just happened. Fake? That didn't make sense. Her father had booked this flight. She had checked in at the counter without any issues. Everything was confirmed. She opened her mouth trying to explain, but Karen cut her off with a sigh, already turning her attention to the next passenger. "Step aside. Next." Aaliyah's face burned with embarrassment. A few people behind her exchanged amused glances, some whispering under their breath. Others simply looked away, uninterested in whatever was happening. She swallowed hard, bending down to pick up the torn pieces of her ticket, her fingers trembling as she gathered them. She looked up again, her voice barely above a whisper. "There must be a mistake. My father booked this ticket. I have my confirmation." Karen let out a short, impatient laugh, shaking her head. "I don't care who booked it. You're not getting on this flight. Step aside before I call security." Aaliyah's heart pounded against her chest. She turned, searching for someone, anyone, who might help her. But all she saw were uninterested faces. The line moved forward without her. People simply stepped around her, treating her like an inconvenience, as if she wasn't even there. Her hands clenched around the torn ticket. She wanted to argue, to fight back, but she was just a kid. Who would believe her over an airline employee? The reality of the situation sank in. She was being kicked off the flight for no reason, and no one was stopping it. She looked back at Karen, who was now smiling warmly at the next passenger, Ethan, a teenage boy with neatly combed blonde hair and an expensive-looking watch. He handed over his ticket, and without hesitation, Karen scanned it and waved him through with a cheerful, "Enjoy your flight, sweetheart." Aaliyah's stomach dropped. It was never about the ticket. Aaliyah felt her throat tighten as she clutched the torn pieces of her ticket. The humiliation burned deep, but more than that, anger was starting to creep in. She hadn't done anything wrong. She had every right to be on that plane, just like everyone else. But standing there watching Karen beam at Ethan as if he were royalty, she understood what was really happening. Her hands clenched into fists. Number, this wasn't fair. Excuse me, a voice spoke up from behind. Aaliyah turned to see Mrs. Patel, an older woman in a floral dress, standing a few feet away, her arms crossed. She had been waiting in line like everyone else, but now her sharp eyes were locked onto Karen. "Why did you tear up that girl's ticket?" Mrs. Patel asked, her voice steady but firm. Karen's smile faltered for a split second before she quickly regained her composure. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you. Please step forward with your ticket." "It does concern me," Mrs. Patel said, "because I've been standing here watching you treat that girl like trash while letting everyone else through without a problem." A few more heads turned. A few murmurs spread through the line. Aaliyah's heart pounded with hope. Maybe, just maybe, someone would stand up for her. Karen's face darkened. "The girl presented a fraudulent ticket. That's the issue here." "That's a lie," Aaliyah snapped, her voice louder than she expected. "My father booked this flight. I checked in with no problem. You didn't even scan my ticket before tearing it up." A hush fell over the line. Karen's jaw tightened. "Security," she called, waving toward the nearby airport officers. "Remove her from the gate." Aaliyah felt her stomach drop as two security guards started walking toward her. Her hands gripped the straps of her backpack as she took a small step back. Was this really happening? Was she about to be dragged out of the airport like a criminal? "Hold on just a second," a deep, commanding voice echoed through the terminal. The kind of voice that made people stop and listen. The security guards froze. The passengers turned toward the sound. And that was when Aaliyah saw him. Captain Daniel Hayes, the pilot. Standing tall in his crisp white uniform, his captain's stripes neatly placed on his shoulders, his sharp blue eyes locked onto Karen with an expression that made her stiffen instantly. Aaliyah's pulse raced. Something was about to change. Captain Daniel Hayes walked toward the gate with a steady, deliberate pace. His polished shoes clicked against the floor, and with each step, the tension in the air grew thicker. Every passenger in line turned to watch. The two security guards who had been approaching Aaliyah immediately stopped in their tracks. Karen straightened her posture, her hands smoothing down her uniform as if that would make a difference. She plastered on a forced smile, but there was a flicker of nervousness in her eyes. She knew she had messed up. "Is there a problem here?" Captain Hayes asked, his voice calm but firm. Karen cleared her throat. "Not at all, Captain." She forced a laugh. "Just a small issue with a passenger." Captain Hayes' eyes flickered to Aaliyah, who still clutched the torn pieces of her ticket. His gaze softened slightly before snapping back to Karen. "A small issue?" he repeated. "Because from what I just witnessed, it looked like you destroyed a passenger's boarding pass without scanning it." Karen's face twitched. "Sir, I followed protocol. She presented a fake ticket. I was just ensuring the integrity of the boarding process." Aaliyah's breath caught in her throat. There it was again. Another lie. Captain Hayes raised an eyebrow. "A fake ticket?" His tone was neutral, but there was something sharp underneath. "How did you determine that exactly?" Karen hesitated, her eyes darting around. Passengers were watching. The other flight attendants behind the counter weren't saying a word. Even the security guards were standing back, waiting for orders. Aaliyah saw her chance. She wasn't going to stay silent anymore. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. "She didn't even check," Aaliyah said, her voice steady but firm. "She tore it up the second I handed it to her." A low murmur spread through the crowd. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's not true," Karen said quickly, shaking her head. "She was causing a scene, so I had to take action." Captain Hayes exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. He turned to one of the flight attendants standing behind the counter. "Check the passenger manifest. Look for her name." Karen's eyes widened slightly. "Captain, that's not necessary. Now." His voice was like steel. The young flight attendant behind the desk, clearly hesitant, started typing into the system. A tense silence filled the air as the seconds passed. Then suddenly she froze. Her eyes widened. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then slowly, she turned to Captain Hayes, swallowing hard. "Sir," she said quietly, "her name is on the list." The entire gate fell silent. Karen's breath hitched. Aaliyah felt her own pulse quicken. Captain Hayes narrowed his eyes. Say that again. The flight attendant licked her lips nervously. Her name is on the first-class manifest. Gasps rippled through the crowd. First class. Aaliyah's fingers tightened around the torn ticket. Karen had tried to kick her off a flight when she was supposed to be in first class. Captain Hayes turned back to Karen, his expression unreadable. But the flicker of disappointment in his eyes was unmistakable. Karen had just made the biggest mistake of her career. Karen's face lost its color. The muscles in her jaw tightened as she struggled to keep her expression neutral. But there was no way out of this. The truth was out. Passengers behind Aaliyah murmured louder now, some shaking their heads, others whispering in disbelief. A young mother holding her toddler whispered to her husband, "She was supposed to be in first class?" Another man scoffed, muttering, "Unbelievable." Aaliyah, still gripping the torn ticket pieces, felt her chest tighten. She should have felt relief, but instead, she was angry. The proof had been there all along. Her name had been in the system. Karen could have checked at any time, but she didn't. She didn't want to. Captain Hayes remained still for a long moment, his sharp blue eyes locked on Karen. His disappointment was heavier than any words he could have spoken. Then finally, he exhaled. "So let me get this straight," he said slowly. "This passenger, whose name is clearly listed on our first-class manifest, was denied boarding because—" Karen's throat bobbed as she swallowed. It was an honest mistake." Captain Hayes' expression didn't change. "An honest mistake?" His voice was steady, but the way he repeated her words made them sound ridiculous. Karen squared her shoulders. "Sir, I was just doing my job. She was acting suspiciously. I had to make a quick judgment call." Aaliyah felt something in her stomach tighten. Suspiciously? She couldn't stop herself. She took a step forward and looked Karen dead in the eyes. "How?" Karen blinked. "What?" Aaliyah's voice was clear now, steady with frustration. "How was I acting suspiciously? Because I handed you my ticket the same way everyone else did? Because I stood in line quietly? Or because I don't look like the people you expected to see in first class?" A hush fell over the gate. Karen's lips parted, but no words came out. She had no answer. Captain Hayes turned back to the young flight attendant at the desk. "Print her a new boarding pass. Immediately." The woman nodded quickly, typing into the system. Within seconds, a fresh ticket printed, crisp and clean. She handed it to Captain Hayes, who then turned and placed it directly in Aaliyah's hands. "Apologies for the inconvenience," he said, his voice firm but kind. "This should never have happened." Aaliyah's fingers curled around the ticket, but the anger inside her didn't fade. It wasn't just an inconvenience. Karen had humiliated her, made her feel powerless, and tried to remove her from the flight as if she didn't belong. And now Karen stood there, shoulders stiff, her hands gripping the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. Captain Hayes wasn't finished. He took a step back, his voice ringing loud enough for everyone to hear. "Gate agents are the first point of contact between our airline and our passengers. It is our responsibility to treat every single traveler with the same level of professionalism and respect. No exceptions." Karen stared straight ahead, refusing to look at him. "When we fail to do that," he continued, "we fail as an airline." A pause. Then finally he turned to the two security guards, who had been standing there awkwardly, waiting for direction. "Gentlemen, you may return to your posts. There is no issue here." The guards exchanged glances before nodding and stepping away. The tension in the air lightened slightly, but something about the way Captain Hayes' jaw clenched told Aaliyah this wasn't over yet. Karen remained stiff, her fingers digging into the counter as if holding on for dear life. The once confident flight attendant, who had so easily dismissed Aaliyah minutes ago, now stood frozen under the weight of her own mistake. Captain Hayes didn't take his eyes off her. His voice, calm but unshakable, cut through the thick silence that had fallen over the gate. "Karen, step aside." Her head snapped toward him. "Sir, Now!" The single word carried more weight than anything else. Karen hesitated, then swallowed hard and moved away from the boarding counter, her steps stiff and reluctant. For the first time, she wasn't in control. The young flight attendant who had found Aaliyah's name on the manifest slid into Karen's place. She offered Aaliyah a small, hesitant smile, and gestured toward the scanner. "Go ahead and scan your ticket. You're all set." Aaliyah's hands were still trembling as she lifted the boarding pass, the fresh, clean one that Captain Hayes had handed her himself. She pressed it against the scanner, waiting for that familiar beep. The sound echoed through the gate. A confirmation? She was supposed to be on this plane. A deep breath escaped her lips, but the tension in her chest remained. As she stepped forward toward the jet bridge, her backpack still slung over her shoulders, she felt every set of eyes on her. Passengers who had ignored her moments ago were now staring, some guilty, some uncomfortable, some pretending they hadn't seen anything at all. And then, just as she was about to disappear into the tunnel leading to the plane, Captain Hayes spoke again. "Karen, meet me in my office after this flight." Karen's entire body stiffened. A few passengers let out small murmurs. Everyone knew what that meant. Karen opened her mouth as if to argue, but nothing came out. She simply nodded, her face now a shade paler than before. Aaliyah didn't look back. She didn't need to, because she knew Karen had just sealed her own fate. Aaliyah stepped onto the jet bridge, her grip still tight around her boarding pass. Her heartbeat was steady now, but the frustration hadn't faded. She had won this round. She had made it onto the plane. But the sting of what happened still sat heavy in her chest. Why had she even needed to fight for something that was hers from the start? She walked down the narrow hallway, feeling the rush of cold air as she entered the plane. A flight attendant inside, Rachel, greeted her with a warm smile. A real smile. "Welcome aboard, Miss Carter," Rachel said, giving a small nod. "Your seat is in first class, right this way." Aaliyah hesitated for a moment, still wrapping her mind around everything. But she followed Rachel, weaving past rows of seats filled with passengers who had already settled in. Some were watching movies, some were flipping through magazines, and some, the ones from the gate who had seen everything, quickly looked away as she passed. She ignored them. When she reached her seat in first class, she saw it instantly. The difference. Plush, wide seats, extra legroom, a personal screen, a menu with gourmet meals, and a flight attendant standing by, ready to assist at any moment. It was a whole different world. Aaliyah slowly sank into her seat, setting her backpack down beside her. The cushion was soft, the space around her comfortable, but it didn't erase what had happened just minutes ago. She exhaled, leaning back. She wanted to relax, to just close her eyes and let go of everything. But the scene at the gate replayed in her mind. The humiliation, the whispers, Karen's sharp, dismissive voice, and then the sound of that ticket ripping. She tightened her grip on the armrest. She wasn't going to forget that anytime soon. A few minutes passed and more passengers trickled onto the plane. The first-class section filled up quickly, and before long the crew began preparing for departure. The soft hum of the engines starting up sent a small vibration through the floor. Then, something unexpected happened. A deep, familiar voice spoke over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Hayes speaking." Aaliyah's eyes snapped open. "Before we take off, I want to take a moment to address something that occurred at the gate today," he continued. A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin. Passengers weren't used to hearing pilots make announcements like this. Aaliyah sat up straighter. He wasn't really going to, was he? "As the captain of this flight, it is my responsibility to ensure that all passengers are treated with respect and fairness," Hayes said. "That did not happen today." Silence. Even the flight attendants at the front of the plane froze. Today, one of our passengers was denied boarding not because of an error, but because of an assumption. That assumption was wrong. Aaliyah's chest tightened. She could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her now, but she didn't turn to look. "I want to make it clear that this airline does not tolerate discrimination in any form. Every passenger deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of appearance, background, or any other factor. If we fail to uphold that, we fail our passengers." The murmurs grew louder. Aaliyah caught the slight shifting of bodies around her. Some of the very same people who had stood in that boarding line were now uncomfortable, suddenly forced to think about what had just happened. Captain Hayes let a few seconds of silence settle before he spoke again. "To the passenger affected by this today, on behalf of this airline, I sincerely apologize." Aaliyah's breath hitched. For the first time since the incident, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't expected. Not anger, Not frustration, but vindication. Because now everyone knew the truth. The plane was silent. Completely, utterly silent. Aaliyah sat frozen in her seat, gripping the armrest as Captain Hayes's words settled over the cabin like a heavy weight. He had just called it out. Publicly. No vague apology, no sugarcoating. He had told the truth. Passengers shifted uncomfortably. Some stole glances at her, realizing exactly who he was talking about. Others, probably the same ones who had ignored what happened at the gate, kept their eyes down, suddenly invested in their magazines or pretending to adjust their seatbelts. Aaliyah's pulse raced. She had spent so long feeling invisible. But now she was the center of attention. Captain Hayes continued, his voice steady but firm. I want to make it clear that an investigation into this incident will take place immediately. This is not how we run things, and it will not happen again. A soft gasp came from one of the passengers in the row ahead. An investigation. That meant real consequences. Aaliyah's fingers curled into her palm. Good. For a moment, she let herself breathe. She had fought so hard just to prove that she had the right to be here, in this seat, on this plane, on this trip that her father had planned for her. But now the weight wasn't on her anymore. It was on them, on the people who had laughed, on the people who had looked away, on the people who thought it wasn't their problem. The flight attendants in first class still looked stunned. They weren't used to hearing their captain call out discrimination so openly. Usually, issues like this got swept under the rug. Apologies were made in private, and the world kept moving. But not this time. A deep voice from across the aisle suddenly spoke up. It's about time someone said something. Aaliyah turned her head slightly. An older man in a business suit, probably in his late 50s, was nodding to himself. His sharp features were unreadable, but his tone carried weight. I've been flying for decades, he said, shifting in his seat, and I've seen things like this happen more times than I can count. People act like it's just an accident. But it's never an accident, is it? His words seemed to ignite a spark in the air. A woman a few seats down sighed, shaking her head. No, it's not. Across the aisle, Mrs. Patel, the woman who had spoken up for Aaliyah back at the gate, lifted her chin and gave a small nod. The energy in the cabin changed. Where there had been silence, there was now quiet agreement. Some of these passengers had witnessed what happened at the gate. They had seen it unfold, and now they couldn't ignore it. The intercom crackled again. Thank you for your time, Captain Hayes finished, his voice steady. Now let's get everyone where they need to be. A slight hum filled the air as the plane prepared for takeoff. The engines roared to life beneath them, and one by one the flight attendants resumed their tasks. But the weight of the announcement still lingered. Aaliyah adjusted her seatbelt, her heart still pounding. She had won. But why did it still feel like the fight wasn't over? Because it wasn't. Not yet. Karen was still out there. And Aaliyah had the sinking feeling that this wasn't the last she'd hear of her. The plane rolled slowly toward the runway, but the atmosphere inside was far from normal. People were restless. Captain Hayes's announcement had left behind an unshakable tension, something unspoken that hung over the passengers like a storm cloud. Aaliyah sat still, staring out the window as the airport lights blurred past. The engines rumbled beneath her, but her mind wasn't focused on the flight anymore. She should have felt relief. She should have felt satisfied. Instead, something kept gnawing at her. She could still hear Karen's voice in her head. Step aside. Security. Remove her. She was acting suspiciously. A deep, frustrated breath escaped her lips. The fact that she had to fight just to prove she belonged here made her stomach turn. And the worst part? It wasn't even over. A movement caught her eye. Across the aisle, a few rows ahead, a passenger was glaring at her. Aaliyah's fingers curled into a fist. She recognized the look instantly. It was the same kind of stare Karen had given her. Cold, dismissive, full of judgment. The woman, probably in her late 40s, wore a neatly pressed blazer and an expensive pearl necklace. Her lips were drawn in a thin, disapproving line. She wasn't happy about what had just happened. Aaliyah didn't break eye contact. She refused to shrink under the weight of someone else's bias. The woman scoffed, muttered something under her breath, and turned away. Aaliyah exhaled, but her muscles remained tense. People like Karen weren't just at the airport. They were everywhere. Suddenly, a soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "You okay?" Aaliyah turned. It was Mrs. Patel, now seated across the aisle, watching her with kind but knowing eyes. Aaliyah hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Yeah." Mrs. Patel sighed, folding her hands in her lap. "You shouldn't have had to go through that." Aaliyah swallowed. "I know." A moment of silence passed between them. The plane jolted slightly as it neared the main runway, but neither of them moved. Then Mrs. Patel leaned in slightly. "People like that, they don't expect to be challenged." Her voice was calm but firm. "They're used to getting away with it." Aliyah's grip tightened around her armrest. She knew Mrs. Patel was right. Karen had humiliated her so easily, so casually, as if it were nothing, because to her, it probably was. Aliyah turned away, staring at the first-class curtain ahead. Karen had tried to kick her off that plane without hesitation. If Captain Hayes hadn't stepped in, she didn't even want to think about what would have happened. Then, as if the universe wasn't done testing her patience, a voice came through the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the brief delay. We are now cleared for departure." Aaliyah sighed, shaking her head. She just wanted to get in the air and leave this entire experience behind. But just as she was about to lean back and close her eyes, a flight attendant from the front of the cabin rushed toward the cockpit, her face pale, her expression tight. Aaliyah noticed it immediately. So did Mrs. Patel. Something was wrong. Whispers spread through the first-class cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, trying to figure out what was happening. Even the flight attendants, who had been preparing for takeoff, stopped what they were doing. Then a few rows ahead, a man leaned toward his wife. "Why are we stopping?" Aaliyah's pulse quickened. The plane hadn't even left the ground yet. Then, before anyone could say another word, the engines powered down. A gasp rippled through the cabin. They weren't taking off. Aaliyah's stomach dropped. Something was definitely wrong. And then, just as the murmurs grew louder, Captain Hayes's voice returned over the intercom. Calm, controlled, but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, there has been an urgent development. Please remain in your seats. This flight is now on hold." A collective hush spread through the plane. Aaliyah's fingers dug into the fabric of her seat. What now? Aaliyah's heart pounded as the plane's engines powered down completely. A hush fell over the cabin, and the tension thickened like a fog rolling in before a storm. Passengers glanced at one another, confused and uneasy. This wasn't a weather delay, and it wasn't a routine announcement. Something was wrong. The flight attendants whispered among themselves, their expressions unreadable. Even Rachel, the kind woman who had welcomed Aaliyah onto the plane, looked tense as she exchanged a quick, nervous glance with another crew member. Aaliyah sat perfectly still, gripping the armrest as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Had someone fallen ill? Was there a mechanical issue? Was it something worse? Then suddenly, footsteps echoed down the jet bridge. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. A few heads turned toward the front of the plane. A uniformed airport official appeared, followed by two security officers. They walked in with purpose, their expressions stiff and unreadable. Aaliyah's breath hitched. Security? Passengers started whispering louder now. One man seated in the first row turned to his wife. "What the hell is going on?" The airport official didn't waste time. He walked straight to the cockpit door and knocked twice. Within seconds, Captain Hayes stepped out. The captain's expression was unreadable, but there was something different about his posture. He was controlled but tense, like he already knew what was coming. One of the security officers leaned in and whispered something to him. Hayes listened without a word, then turned his sharp gaze toward the flight attendant standing near the front. His next words sent a chill down Aaliyah's spine. "Karen Monroe, stand up." The air was sucked straight out of the cabin. Passengers gasped. Some turned in their seats. Others looked completely confused. Aaliyah's stomach twisted into a knot so tight it nearly hurt. Karen. Karen had done something. Again. At first, nothing happened. The tension stretched, and for a brief moment, Aaliyah thought that maybe Karen had already left the plane, that maybe she had walked away before anyone could stop her. But then, a slow, deliberate movement. From the back of the first-class section, Karen stood. Her face was eerily blank, but Aaliyah saw it, the flicker of panic in her eyes. Her hands trembled slightly as she straightened her uniform. But unlike before, she wasn't in control anymore. The whispers turned into full-on murmurs now. Passengers stared. Some people craned their necks trying to get a better look. Others sat in silence, as if they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Karen swallowed hard, lifting her chin slightly. But she didn't say a word. One of the security officers stepped forward. "Ma'am, please gather your belongings." Karen's fingers curled into fists at her sides. "What's the meaning of this?" Her voice was tight, strained, so different from the sharp, dismissive tone she had used at the gate. Captain Hayes didn't flinch. His expression remained calm, controlled, but his next words sealed her fate. "Karen Monroe, effective immediately, you are being removed from this flight." The cabin erupted. Gasps. Whispers turned into full-blown conversations. Someone in the back let out a low whistle. A passenger in business attire shook his head, muttering, "Damn." Karen stiffened. "This is a mistake." Her voice was quieter now, weaker. Captain Hayes didn't budge. "No, the mistake was what you did at that gate. The mistake was making an assumption about a passenger and abusing your authority. And now that mistake has consequences." Aaliyah watched, frozen in her seat. She had never seen anything like this before. Karen's eyes darted around the cabin, looking for support, for sympathy. But she found none. The same passengers who had ignored Aaliyah's humiliation at the gate, they weren't ignoring this. Karen opened her mouth as if to argue, to plead, but one look at Captain Hayes told her it was pointless. Slowly, stiffly, she reached for her carry-on bag. Her hands shook slightly as she pulled it from the overhead bin, her knuckles white from gripping the handle too tightly. One of the security officers gestured toward the jet bridge. "Ma'am, this way." Karen's jaw clenched, her lips pressed into a thin line. She hesitated. Then, with a final, sharp inhale, she walked down the aisle, past the rows of watching eyes, past the very passengers she had once held power over. And for the first time, she was the one being removed. The moment she stepped through the jet bridge, the plane door closed behind her with a heavy, final thud. A slow, almost stunned silence filled the cabin. Nobody spoke. Then, soft applause. It started with a few passengers, then more. A light clap, then another, until a small but unmistakable wave of applause filled the first-class section. Not loud, not obnoxious, but enough. Enough to say justice had been served. Aaliyah sat back in her seat, exhaling for what felt like the first time in hours. Karen was gone, and for the first time, Aaliyah truly felt like she belonged here. The applause faded, but the tension still lingered in the air, like an echo of what had just happened. Aaliyah sat still, gripping the armrest, trying to process everything. Karen was gone. Really gone. For the first time since stepping into the airport, Aaliyah felt a sense of relief settle in her chest. But at the same time, there was something else. A strange, quiet exhaustion. Not physical, but emotional. She had fought so hard to be here, just to exist in a space where she already belonged. She let out a slow breath, closing her eyes for a second. Was this what justice was supposed to feel like? She heard a voice beside her. "Are you all right?" Aaliyah turned and saw Mrs. Patel watching her with the same patient, knowing expression. She hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I think so." Mrs. Patel studied her for a moment before leaning back in her seat. "Good." A small pause. "But don't ever forget this." Aaliyah frowned slightly. "Forget what?" The older woman's voice was calm but serious. "That you were right all along." Aaliyah felt her chest tighten. Mrs. Patel sighed, glancing at the passengers around them, some still murmuring, others pretending nothing had happened. "People will try to make you feel like you imagine things. Like it wasn't that bad. Like you overreacted." She looked back at Aaliyah. "Don't let them." Aaliyah stared at her, the words sinking in deeper than she expected. She already knew what she meant. There would be passengers on this flight who witnessed everything and still chose to act like it wasn't a big deal. Some would say nothing at all. Others might later claim Karen didn't deserve to be fired. Somewhere in an office, Karen was probably already making excuses, twisting the story to make herself the victim. Aaliyah didn't have to guess. She had seen it happen before. Her grip on the armrest tightened. Number. She wasn't going to forget this. She wasn't going to let anyone make her feel like she had been wrong to speak up. She had spent her whole life seeing people walk away from situations like this without consequence. Not this time. She straightened her posture. I won't. Mrs. Patel gave a small smile, one of quiet approval. Aaliyah turned, looking around the cabin again. Some passengers were still lost in their own world, scrolling through their phones, flipping through magazines, adjusting their seatbelts as if nothing had happened, as if this had just been a moment of mild inconvenience before they got back to their own lives. But not everyone. She noticed the man in the business suit, the one who had spoken up earlier, watching her from across the aisle. When she met his gaze, he gave her a single nod before turning back to his laptop. Even Rachel, the flight attendant, who had treated her with kindness from the start, gave her a quick glance, a small but reassuring expression on her face before she turned to check on another passenger. Some people had paid attention. Some people had learned something. That was enough. A crackle from the intercom snapped everyone's attention forward. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We are now cleared for takeoff. Flight attendants, please prepare for departure. Aaliyah let out a slow breath as the engines rumbled beneath them again, this time for real. The plane rolled forward, moving steadily toward the runway. She felt the shift as it picked up speed, the familiar pull of gravity pressing her into the seat as it lifted off the ground. Upper, higher. The lights of the city blurred beneath them, fading into the darkness of the sky. Aaliyah stared out the window, watching as the world below grew smaller and smaller, her reflection faintly visible against the glass. And for the first time in hours, she allowed herself to smile. She was in the air, right where she was always meant to be. The plane climbed higher, the lights of the city fading into a sea of darkness below. The engines hummed steadily, the slight pressure in Aaliyah's ears reminding her that she was finally in the air. It was over, or at least that's what she kept telling herself. She leaned her head against the window, watching as the last traces of the world below disappeared behind layers of thick clouds. It should have felt freeing. She should have felt lighter now that she had won. But there was still something sitting heavy in her chest. Her fingers traced the edge of the armrest, her thoughts tangled with everything that had happened. She knew this feeling too well, that lingering doubt, because even after the truth had come out, even after Karen had been removed, after Captain Hayes had made his announcement, after the security officers had escorted her off the plane, there would still be people who thought she had been the problem. She could almost hear it already. It wasn't that serious. Maybe it really was just a mistake. Why did the pilot have to make such a big deal out of it? She got what she wanted, didn't she? What more does she want? Aaliyah closed her eyes for a moment, letting out a slow breath. It didn't matter that she had been right. Some people would always look for a way to twist the truth. She knew that when she landed, Karen would already be working on her version of the story. Maybe she'd call the airline and claim she was just doing her job. Maybe she'd tell her friends and family that she had been unfairly targeted. Maybe she'd even cry, saying that she had been fired over a misunderstanding. Aaliyah's fingers clenched. It was never a misunderstanding. Karen had ripped up her ticket without hesitation. She had dismissed her, humiliated her, and only regretted it when she got caught. That was the truth. But people like Karen, they never thought they were wrong. She turned from the window and glanced around the first-class cabin. Everything had gone back to normal. Flight attendants moved down the aisles, offering drinks and snacks as if nothing had happened. Passengers scrolled through their phones or settled into their seats. Conversations hushed. No one was talking about it anymore. Just like that, it was over for them, but not for her. Because no matter how many times something like this happened, it was always the person who experienced it that carried the weight the longest. A soft sigh came from across the aisle. Aaliyah turned her head slightly. Mrs. Patel was watching her again, her expression unreadable. After a long moment, the older woman spoke. It's exhausting, isn't it? Aaliyah's throat tightened. Because yes, it was. She didn't answer right away. She wasn't even sure what to say. Mrs. Patel shifted in her seat, adjusting the thin scarf draped around her shoulders. I've been where you are, you know. Aaliyah blinked. What do you mean? The older woman smiled faintly, though there was something distant in her gaze. When I was younger, I used to travel a lot for work. And back then, People like me? She shook her head. We weren't exactly welcomed everywhere. Aaliyah sat up a little straighter. Mrs. Patel sighed. I had people question my documents. I had people assume I didn't belong in certain spaces. Sometimes they didn't even try to hide it. She let out a short, dry laugh. Once I checked into a hotel for a business conference, and the woman at the front desk looked at me and said, "Oh, the housekeeping entrance is around the back." Aaliyah's stomach twisted. Mrs. Patel smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I was wearing a suit, had my briefcase in my hand, and still she didn't even consider that I could be a guest. Aaliyah swallowed hard. She knew that feeling all too well. Mrs. Patel gave her a knowing look. That feeling you have right now, that frustration, that exhaustion, it doesn't go away overnight. Aaliyah looked down at her lap, her fingers playing with the edge of her sweater. So how do you deal with it? Mrs. Patel leaned back, folding her hands neatly in her lap. You remind yourself that you were right and that they were wrong. She said it so simply, so matter-of-factly, as if it were just that easy. Maybe it was. Aaliyah nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. She was right. Karen was wrong. No matter how the story got twisted, no matter what Karen told herself to feel better about what happened, the truth wouldn't change. And at the end of the day, Karen had walked off that plane with nothing. Aaliyah, she was still here, and she wasn't going to waste another second doubting herself. She sat back in her seat, exhaling as she stared out the window again. The clouds outside looked endless, stretching far beyond anything she could see. For the first time since stepping onto the plane, she finally let go of the anger sitting in her chest, because she was flying above it now. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane leveled out at cruising altitude. The seatbelt sign flickered off, and the familiar ding of the announcement system signaled that passengers were free to move about the cabin. Flight attendants began their rounds, pushing carts of refreshments down the aisles, offering drinks and warm towels to the first-class passengers. But Aaliyah barely noticed any of it. She was still staring out the window, her mind racing even though the world outside was nothing but endless sky. She had spent so much energy fighting for something that should have been simple: a seat on a plane, a trip her father had paid for, the right to exist in a space that was already hers. She had been right. She knew that. She felt it deep in her bones. And yet, she also knew that somewhere, Karen was sitting in an office or a break room, spinning the story to make herself the victim. Karen wasn't humiliated because she had done something wrong. Number Karen would be humiliated because she got caught. Aaliyah exhaled sharply, forcing herself to unclench her fists. She didn't want to waste another second thinking about that woman. She turned her attention back to the cabin. Most of the first-class passengers had already settled into their routines, watching movies, reading, answering emails on their laptops. Some of them had been at the gate when everything happened. Some had even clapped when Karen was removed from the plane. And yet now, it was as if nothing had ever happened. It was always like this. They got to move on. But Aaliyah, she still carried it. She let out a slow breath and reached into her backpack, pulling out her phone. There was no service this high up, but she wasn't trying to text anyone. She just needed something familiar, something grounding. She opened her photo gallery and scrolled through her recent pictures. And then, there it was, a picture of her and her father, taken just a few days ago at the airport when he had surprised her with the first-class ticket. He had wrapped his arm around her, grinning, telling her how proud he was that she was traveling on her own for the first time. He had been so excited for her, and she had been excited too, until Karen had tried to take that away. A small lump formed in Aaliyah's throat. Her father didn't even know what had happened yet. Would she tell him? A part of her wanted to. She could already imagine his reaction, the way his expression would darken, the way his voice would get quiet, controlled, but full of rage. But then what? Would he call the airline? Demand answers? Would he go public with the story? Make sure Karen never worked at an airport again? Maybe. But another part of Aaliyah wondered if it even mattered. Karen was already gone. She had faced consequences, real ones. That was rare enough. Aaliyah sighed and locked her phone, setting it face down on her tray table. Across the aisle, Mrs. Patel was watching her again, her gaze warm but knowing. You're thinking about telling him, aren't you? She asked. Aaliyah blinked, caught off guard. How did you? Mrs. Patel smiled knowingly. I'm a mother. I know that look. Aaliyah hesitated, then gave a small nod. Yeah. Mrs. Patel shifted slightly in her seat, adjusting the thin scarf around her neck. And what's stopping you? Aaliyah exhaled, staring at her phone again. I don't know. I guess I just don't want him to feel like he failed me. Mrs. Patel's face softened. He didn't fail you. Aaliyah swallowed. I know, but he tried to make this trip special for me. He wanted it to be perfect. If I tell him what happened, it'll ruin that. Mrs. Patel nodded slowly, considering her words. Then after a long moment, she said something that Aaliyah wasn't expecting. Maybe, or maybe it'll make him even prouder of you. Aaliyah blinked. What? Mrs. Patel smiled. You stood up for yourself. You didn't let her push you aside. You didn't let her erase you. And in the end, you won. Don't you think that's something worth telling him? Aaliyah hadn't thought about it that way. She let the words settle in, rolling them over in her mind. Her father had raised her to be strong, to be aware of the world but never to let it break her. He had always told her that her voice mattered, even when people tried to silence it. Maybe this wasn't about ruining the trip. Maybe it was about proving that she had learned exactly what he had always taught her. Her fingers hovered over her phone for a moment before she picked it up again, unlocking it. She stared at the screen, her father's contact name right at the top. She hesitated just for a second. Then she pressed record and started a voice message. Hey, Dad. So, something happened at the airport. Her voice was steady, not shaken, not broken, just steady. Because she wasn't just telling him about what had happened. She was telling him how she had fought back, and how in the end, she won. Aaliyah held the phone close to her lips, the small red recording symbol blinking at the top of the screen. She hesitated for only a second before speaking. Hey, Dad. So, something happened at the airport. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Everything's okay now. I'm on the plane. But there was this flight attendant, Karen. She tore up my ticket. Her own voice sounded strange to her, calm, measured, but carrying the weight of what had just happened. She expected her fingers to shake as she held the phone, but they didn't. She didn't even check if it was real. She just assumed, and she called security on me. A small exhale escaped her lips. She forced herself to keep going. I tried to explain, but no one listened at first. It wasn't until the pilot, Captain Hayes, stepped in that everything changed. He checked the system. My name was right there. I was supposed to be in first class the whole time. Aaliyah glanced around the cabin, still filled with passengers who had long since moved on. Some were sipping champagne, others scrolling through their phones, as if they hadn't witnessed a single thing back at the gate. They had the privilege to forget. She didn't. Her fingers tightened around the phone. She got fired, she continued, her voice quieter now. They took her off the flight. She hesitated again, her mind replaying Karen's final moments. The stiff set of her shoulders, the way her face drained of color, the way she had looked around, desperate for someone to defend her, only to find that no one did. That moment would stick with Karen the same way Aaliyah would always remember the way she had been humiliated at the gate. She let out a slow breath. I don't know what to feel right now, Dad. Her voice cracked slightly. I know I should be happy. I mean, I won, right? But I keep thinking about how easy it was for her to do that to me. How quickly she dismissed me. How fast she called security. Like I was just... She stopped herself, blinking quickly. Like I was just nothing. A pause, then she pushed forward. I don't think this is the first time she's done something like this. And it won't be the last time someone like her does it to someone else. She glanced over at Mrs. Patel, who was looking out her own window now, lost in her own thoughts. She had been through it before too, and so had millions of others. Aaliyah swallowed. I guess I wanted to tell you, because I know you would have wanted to know. She chewed her lip, unsure of how to end the message. I love you, Dad, and I'll see you soon. With a final tap, she sent the voice note. The moment the message disappeared, she felt a strange sense of finality settle over her. She had spoken it aloud. She had acknowledged what happened instead of burying it, and now someone who cared about her knew. She set the phone down on the tray table and closed her eyes. The hum of the plane filled the silence, steady and endless. It should have been just a normal flight, a simple trip. But now it was something bigger. And the worst part? She knew that as soon as she landed, she'd have to tell this story again. People would ask questions, friends, family, maybe even strangers if the airline made a statement. Some people would believe her, some would act like it wasn't a big deal, and some would question her, twist her words, or try to make her feel like she was overreacting. But she wasn't. And no matter how many times she had to repeat her story, she would tell it exactly how it happened. Because if she didn't, people like Karen would keep doing it. And next time, the person being humiliated might not have a pilot like Captain Hayes watching. A deep breath filled her lungs. She wasn't going to forget this, and she wasn't going to let the world forget it either. Aaliyah kept her phone face down on the tray table, her heartbeat slowing to a steady rhythm. The weight in her chest wasn't gone, but it felt lighter. She had spoken her truth. Now it was out there, living in the space between her and her father, waiting for him to hear it. She didn't know how he would react. Maybe he would call the airline immediately, demanding to speak to the highest-ranking person he could find. Maybe he would sit in silence for a long time, trying to contain his frustration. Or maybe he would just be proud. She turned her head and looked around the cabin again. The flight attendants had resumed their normal duties, offering drinks and snacks with polite smiles. Rachel, the kind one, walked by, checking on passengers, her movements graceful and practiced. When she passed by Aaliyah's seat, she paused for a moment. "Can I get you anything?" Rachel asked, her voice soft. Aaliyah hesitated, then shook her head. "No, I'm okay." Rachel studied her for a second before giving her a small, knowing nod. "All right, let me know if you need anything." And just like that, she was gone again, blending back into the rhythm of the flight. Aaliyah exhaled, leaning back in her seat. For everyone else, this was just another flight. For her, it was something much bigger. The truth was, even though Karen was gone, the feeling of what happened hadn't left. Because she knew something now. Something she had always suspected but never fully experienced before today. The world didn't give everyone the same rules. Some people could walk through life without second-guessing their place in a space. They could hand over their ticket at the gate, board without issue, take their seat, order a drink, and never think twice about whether they belonged there. But for people like her, it was different. People like Karen could decide, in a single moment, with a single action, that she didn't belong. And just like that, she could be erased. Today, she had fought back. Today, she had won. But what about next time? What about the next person standing at a boarding gate, holding their ticket, only to have someone like Karen decide they weren't worth a second glance? Would they be strong enough to fight for themselves? Would anyone speak up for them? Would they be lucky enough to have someone like Captain Hayes watching? Aaliyah clenched her fists. It shouldn't come down to luck. The thought made her stomach twist. How many people had lost their flights, missed their opportunities, been turned away, humiliated, or treated like they didn't belong, all because of a gate agent, a security officer, a hotel clerk, a store manager, a teacher, a boss? How many of them had walked away without justice? Too many. Mrs. Patel had been right. This wouldn't be the last time something like this happened. And next time, maybe there wouldn't be an audience. Maybe there wouldn't be a captain willing to stop the plane. Maybe security wouldn't hesitate before removing someone for a reason as empty as, "She looked suspicious." Maybe next time there wouldn't be a fight, because people would be too tired to keep fighting. Aaliyah exhaled slowly. She was not tired. Not yet. She turned her phone over again, staring at the screen. The message to her father had been sent, but there was one more thing she needed to do. She opened her notes app and typed quickly, her thumbs moving over the screen with purpose. "If you have ever been denied something you deserve because someone judged you before they even knew you, I want to hear your story." She hesitated for only a second before continuing. "Because I will never forget what happened today, and I don't want the world to forget either." Aaliyah copied the text and pasted it into a new post on social media. She stared at it for a moment, knowing that the second she hit send, there would be no going back. People would react. Some would support her. Some would doubt her. Some would try to silence her. But she would not be erased. She hit post. And just like that, the truth belonged to more than just her. It belonged to everyone. Aaliyah stared at her phone, watching as the post loaded, her words now floating in the digital world for anyone to see. There was no turning back. She had spoken, and now she waited. The plane hummed beneath her, steady and strong, carrying her further away from the place where all of this had started. She should have felt relief. She should have been able to close her eyes and sink into the comfort of her seat, letting herself enjoy what was supposed to be a simple, normal trip. But this wasn't normal. Nothing about what had happened today was normal, except that it was. That was the problem. She locked her phone and set it on the tray table again, exhaling as she looked out the window. Thousands of feet in the air, flying over a world that too often tried to make people like her feel small. Not today. She glanced across the aisle where Mrs. Patel sat quietly, gazing at the seat back in front of her, lost in thought. The older woman hadn't spoken in a while, but her presence alone was comforting. It was a reminder that she wasn't alone. Aaliyah turned back to the window, letting the soft glow of the cabin lights blur against the glass. Then her phone vibrated. A single message popped up on the screen. "Dad, call me when you land." Aaliyah's breath caught. He had heard the message. She didn't know what he was thinking. She could only imagine what emotions had crossed his face when he listened. Anger, frustration, maybe even helplessness, knowing he hadn't been there to protect her. But he had always taught her that her voice mattered. And today she had used it. Her phone vibrated again. Another notification. Then another. Her heart pounded as she unlocked the screen. Dozens of likes, shares, comments. People were already responding to her post. Strangers, friends, people she had never met before, but who had lived the same moment in different places, in different ways. Some comments were short, simple. "This happened to me at a hotel once." "They did the same thing to my dad last year." "I've been there. I know that feeling." Others were longer, stories of people who had been turned away, questioned, dismissed, erased, just because someone like Karen had decided they didn't belong. And then mixed in with all the personal experiences, there were the other comments. "Are you sure it wasn't just a mistake? Not everything is about race. Sounds like you're just looking for attention." Aaliyah felt her stomach twist. She had known this was coming. She had expected it. Some people would never understand. Some people would never want to understand. She clenched her jaw and closed her eyes for a second. She could delete the post, shut it all down, walk away before the flood of voices, good and bad, became too much. Or she could leave it up. Let the truth stay right where it belonged. She exhaled slowly. She wasn't going to erase her own story just because it made people uncomfortable. With a deep breath, she locked her phone and sat back in her seat. Outside, the stars stretched across the sky, endless and unwavering. The world below was still turning, and when she landed, she would step off this plane, not just as someone who had fought for her seat, but as someone who had claimed her place, because she belonged, and she always had. If you think justice was served today, hit that like button. Let me know in the comments, what would you have done in this situation? And if you love stories like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and I'll see you in the next one.